There are places on this planet where you can scream at the top of your lungs and no one will hear you, but there are stations buried in Arctic ice, observatories on top of wind-swept peaks, outposts so remote that the nearest human being is 100 miles away. The people who staff these places get used to the solitude, but sometimes the solitude gets used to them. Welcome to True Terror Files Official. Remote outposts attract a certain kind of person. You have to be comfortable with your own thoughts, okay with the sound of wind and the creak of ice, able to go weeks without seeing another face. The pay is good, the scenery is stark and beautiful, and the work is simple: monitor the equipment, log the data, keep the generator running. But every once in a while, someone stationed at the edge of the world experiences something that isn't in the job description. Something that makes them question whether they're really as alone as they thought. Tonight, 3 people who worked at remote outposts share the moments the isolation cracked. A meteorologist in Alaska who discovered that her station's door wasn't keeping the cold out, it was keeping something else in. An observer in New Hampshire who learned that the fog on the mountain wasn't empty. And a researcher in the high Arctic who found something frozen in the ice that she was never supposed to see. Hey, let's step outside. Yara. Bashara had been a meteorologist for the National Weather Service for 6 years when she volunteered for a 4-month winter rotation at Station Kodiak 7, a remote automated weather outpost on a treeless island in the Aleutians. The station was a single prefab building bolted to a concrete pad, packed with instruments, a small bunk room, and a kitchenette. Her only company was the wind, which howled at a steady 40 knots most days, and the occasional radio check-in from the mainland. And the first month was peaceful. She fell into a rhythm wake-up. Check the barometer, log the temperature, clear ice off the anemometer, eat, read, sleep. The isolation felt clean, almost meditative. Then, on the 33rd night, she woke to a sound she hadn't heard before, scratching at the door. The station's door was a heavy steel thing with a rubber seal, designed to keep out the brutal Aleutian weather. It opened inward. The scratching was coming from the outside, low down, like an animal trying to get in. Yara grabbed her flashlight and walked to the door. The scratching stopped. She pressed her ear to the cold metal, nothing but wind. She shrugged it off and went back to bed. The next night, the scratching returned. This time it was accompanied by a soft, rhythmic thumping. Thump, pause, thump, pause, like someone knocking with an open palm. She checked the peephole, a small fisheye lens set into the door. The exterior light was on, casting a pool of yellow on the snow. There was nothing there. Just the empty tundra and the distant glimmer of the sea. She went back to bed, but she didn't sleep well. On the 5th night, the scratching was frantic, desperate. It started at the bottom of the door and worked its way up, like fingernails dragging across the steel. Then the door handle rattled. Yara sat up in her bunk, heart pounding. The handle rattled again, harder this time. Someone or something was trying to get in. She grabbed the heavy mag light from beside her bunk and approached the door. The rattling stopped. The wind outside howled. She undid the deadbolt. She cracked the door open. The cold hit her like a wall. She aimed her flashlight into the darkness. The snow around the station was pristine. No footprints, no tracks, nothing. But on the outside of the steel door, at chest height, there were handprints. Not human handprints, or not exactly. They were too large, the fingers too long, the palms too narrow. And they were pressed into the frost that had formed on the metal, the heat of whatever had touched it leaving dark impressions in the ice. Yara slammed the door and threw the deadbolt. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. She sat with her back against the far wall, watching the door, the mag light in her lap. The scratching didn't return that night, but she heard something else. A voice, faint, carried on the wind, almost lost in the howl. It said her name, Yara, just once. She radioed the mainland the next morning and requested an early extraction. They told her the weather was too rough for a chopper and she'd have to wait at least a week. She spent that week sleeping in the instrument room with the door barricaded by a heavy equipment crate. Every night, the scratching returned. Every morning, the handprints were back on the door, fresh and dark. When the extraction team finally arrived, they found Yara sitting on the floor of the station, staring at the door. She wouldn't speak, she just pointed. The team lead examined the outside of the door. The handprints were still there, frozen into the metal, too large to be human. He took a photograph, filed a report, and never mentioned it again. Yara transferred to a desk job in Anchorage and never returned to the field. But sometimes, when the wind blows a certain way against her office window, she hears that voice again, saying her name, still waiting outside. Kelton Farrow had spent 2 winters as an observer at the Mount Washington Observatory, and he'd seen weather that would make most people curl into a ball and cry. 100-mile-an-hour winds, temperatures that dropped to 40 below, freezing fog so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. He loved it. The observatory was a concrete bunker chained to the summit, and during the winter shifts, Kelton shared it with 2 other observers and an intern. On this particular night, a January storm was hammering the peak with winds gusting to 130 miles per hour. The building shook. The windows rattled. The 3 observers and the intern, a young woman named Sloane, were in the main common room, playing cards and trying to ignore the howl. Sloane got up to make tea and glanced out the small double-paned window that faced the west. She screamed. Kelton and the other observer rushed over. Sloane was pointing at the window, her face white. There was a face, she said, pressed against the glass. Looking in, Kelton peered out. Nothing but the swirling white chaos of the storm. He told Sloane it was just her imagination, the fog playing tricks, the wind throwing ice against the glass. She shook her head. No, it was a face. A man's face. He looked burned. They calmed her down and went back to their cards. But an hour later, Kelton saw it too. He'd gotten up to use the bathroom, and on his way back, he glanced at the west window. The storm had cleared for a moment, the clouds parting to reveal a sliver of moonlight on the snow. And there on the other side of the glass was a face. It was a man, or had been. The skin was raw and red, blistered, peeling away in strips. The eyes were wide and white, no pupils. The mouth was open in a silent scream. It was looking directly at Kelton. He stumbled back, knocking over a chair. The face vanished. The clouds closed in. The wind resumed its howl. Kelton stood there, shaking, trying to convince himself it was a trick of the light. Then the radio on the desk crackled. The observatory's radio was tuned to the emergency frequency, but it rarely picked up anything except static. Tonight, it was picking up a voice. Faint, distant, broken, lost. Can't find the summit, please? Burning up. Kelton grabbed the mic. This is Mount Washington Observatory. Identify yourself. Over. The voice came back, clearer now, desperate. Help me. I can see the lights. I can see you. Why won't you let me in? Kelton looked at the window. The face was back, pressed against the glass, the blistered hands flat on the pane. The mouth moved, and the voice came through the radio at the same time. It's so cold out here, but I'm burning, please. Open the window. Kelton dropped the mic. Roll. He backed away from the window, his eyes fixed on the face. The other observers had come into the room and were staring. They saw it too. The face stayed there for what felt like hours, the hands occasionally sliding down the glass, leaving greasy smears. Then, just before dawn, it faded. The storm cleared. The sun rose over the white mountains. Kelton and the others went outside to check the area around the west window. There were no footprints in the snow, no sign anyone had been there. But pressed into the rime ice on the window frame were handprints, human-sized. And when Kelton researched the observatory's history later that week, he found a record from 1934. An observer named Martin Dressler had been caught in a sudden whiteout while making an exterior measurement. He'd gotten disoriented, lost his way back to the door, and wandered off the summit. They found his body 3 days later, frozen solid, 100 yards from the building. The cause of death was hypothermia. But the coroner's report noted something strange. Dressler's skin showed signs of severe burning paradoxical undressing. They called it a phenomenon where freezing victims feel like they're on fire. He'd torn off most of his clothes. His hands were pressed flat against the rock as if he'd been trying to push through solid stone. Kelton finished his winter rotation, but he never looked out the west window again. On stormy nights, when the wind howls at 130 miles per hour, the radio in the common room still picks up a voice, asking to be let in. Dr. Paloma Ricci had spent 3 years planning her expedition to Ellesmere Island, the northernmost tip of Canada, where she would study ice core samples to track climate patterns dating back thousands of years. The Outpost was a collection of insulated shelters and a drilling rig, staffed by Paloma and 2 graduate students, a lean operation for a 6-month deployment. The work was grueling but exhilarating. They drilled deep into the ancient ice, pulling up cylinders of frozen history, cataloging air bubbles trapped since the last ice age. On the 42nd day, Paloma's drill hit something at a depth of 200 meters that wasn't ice. The drill bit seized, the motor wind. Then the whole rig shuddered and stopped. She pulled the core barrel up and examined the end. The bit was mangled, the carbide teeth snapped off. Embedded in the twisted metal was a fragment of something dark. She pried it out and held it under the light. It was wood, old, dark, waterlogged wood. There shouldn't have been wood 200 meters down in the Greenland ice sheet. No trees had grown on Ellesmere for millions of years. Paloma made a decision she'd regret. She widened the borehole with a thermal drill and lowered a camera. The grainy feed showed the inside of the ice layers of white and blue, the occasional bubble of ancient air. Then, at 200 meters, the ice stopped. The camera emerged into open space, a void, a cavern inside the glacier, its walls smooth and glistening. And in the center of that cavern, frozen into the floor, was a ship. A wooden ship. Its mast broken, its hull crushed but intact. It looked ancient Viking, maybe, or something older. The camera panned across the deck. Paloma saw them. Figures frozen solid, standing on the deck, their faces tilted up toward the borehole as if they'd been waiting. Their skin was dark and leathery, their eyes open and milky. Their mouths were stretched into grins that showed too many teeth. Paloma's grad students were watching over her shoulder.
Ah,
One of them whispered, "Dr. Ricci, we need to seal the hole." But Paloma couldn't look away. The camera feed flickered, and one of the figures on the ship moved, its head tilted. Its arm rose, pointing directly at the camera. At her, the audio feed, which should have been silent, crackled to life. A voice, deep, resonant, speaking a language Paloma didn't recognize, but she understood it anyway. "You woke us. Now you let us out." The ice around the borehole began to crack. Paloma killed the camera and ordered the hole sealed. They pumped hot water down to collapse the void, then backfilled with slush that would freeze solid in hours. But that night, the outpost's instruments began to fail. The temperature inside the main shelter dropped to 20 below, despite the heater running full blast. The lights flickered and died. And outside, in the permanent twilight of the Arctic winter, Paloma saw shapes moving across the ice. Tall, thin shapes, walking against the wind, their movements jerky and wrong. They circled the outpost all night. Paloma and her students huddled in the dark, listening to the crunch of footsteps on snow, the occasional scrape of something against the shelter's metal walls. At dawn, the shapes were gone, but pressed into the frost on every window were handprints, long-fingered, inhuman, and carved into the ice just outside the door were symbols Paloma had seen before in the camera feed on the hull of that frozen ship. She radioed for extraction. It took 3 days for a plane to reach them. By then, the outpost was buried in snow that had fallen from a clear sky. Paloma never published her findings. She buried the data, falsified the core logs, and left academia within a year. But she knows what's under the ice on Ellesmere. She knows that something ancient and patient is down there, frozen but not dead. And she knows that the ice is melting faster every year. One day that ship will be free, and whatever crew is still waiting on its deck will walk again. 3 outposts, 3 watchers, and 3 encounters with the things that isolation attracts. Yara Bashara learned that the door to Station Kodiak's Evan wasn't just keeping the weather out. Kelton Faro discovered that some observers never leave their posts, even after death. And Dr. Paloma Ricci found something frozen in the ice that should have stayed buried forever. The edges of the map are full of places like these weather stations, research outposts, lonely facilities where the only sound is the wind. But the next time you're in a remote place and you hear a knock at the door, or see a face in the window, or feel the temperature drop for no reason, remember that you might not be as alone as you think. This has been True Terror Files Official. If you've worked a remote job and seen something you can't explain, drop it in the comments. Like, subscribe, ring that bell. And if you're ever stationed at the edge of the world, maybe keep the door locked.